All right, we're back. Welcome back to Specialness. I'm Jeff.
I'm Kim.
And I think where we left off last time, we were on our way to the hospital.
We were.
For our first real inpatient stay. Well, we didn't know that at the time, but
No,
I
we
mean,
didn't.
what ended up being our first inpatient stay with Cason.
Mm-hmm.
So,
because let's kind of review real
yeah,
quick.
just kind of reset.
We woke up. Well, Friday when I picked him up from school, he wasn't acting right. He seemed lethargic. Didn't really want to eat, and I at first
Which is weird.
And at first we thought, oh, maybe he's just getting sick. And as we'd said before, when you're on lithium, you need to drink a lot and make sure you pee a lot, just because you need to flush it out of your system.
Right.
And we were kind of wondering, I don't know how much he's going to the bathroom. I don't know how much he's drinking, but maybe he's just getting sick. We'll wait until the morning, Saturday morning. Because again, everything happens on a weekend with Cason, right? So Saturday morning, we go in and wake him up, which again was very unusual because he was the one that gets up at 4. And we're like, why is he still in bed? And we go in there and he's very lethargic, like just not himself.
He didn't even seem to be aware of where he was.
No. And we were like, okay, this isn't good. So I called his doctor, his psychiatrist, and was like, okay, these are the symptoms. This is kind of what we're seeing. And she's like, you need to go to the ER. So we packed up.
Which was good.
Which
because,
was good.
We wouldn't have known better.
Right.
Clearly. And she certainly have heard stories of people saying, well, let's just keep an eye on him and we'll see what happens. I'm glad she didn't do any of that. And she told us to get there as soon as we could.
Right. So we make the trek down there and it's busy. All ERs are busy and they kind of do a quick, I don't know if they call it triage or what, but you kind of go in and they do a quick screening.
Right.
And we tell them his information. Well, because he was in their psych unit 6 months or whatever previously, all his information comes up, all the meds he's on. And he's labeled the psych patient, which will start our journey of hours and hours.
Yeah, and we did know. I mean, our doctor had told us that sounds like he might have lithium toxicity, which is the first time we'd really heard that term. Mm-hmm. It just meant that the lithium hadn't gotten out of his system. And she had told us that it could be dangerous. At the time, I don't think we realized how dangerous it could be. Mm-hmm. But that's why we went.
Right.
We went because of the physical issue of having lithium toxicity. And when we arrived and they started talking through, what kind of care we were going to get, it was pretty apparent pretty quickly that we were going to be there a while because they kept asking us, we need to admit him to psych. And we were like, this isn't a psych issue.
Right.
He needs an IV probably, or we need a way to flush his system. This isn't a mental health issue, a breakdown, anything like that. This is a physical problem. And, we sat in the waiting room a while, and then they moved us to a room.
Right.
An
ER room. It was an ER.
Yeah, I mean, it was an ER room.
That had a sliding door.
Yeah.
So we were kind of in our own room. Yeah.
And you would, being an ER room, you would have expected that once you're in the room, you're probably going to get treated pretty quickly because it's an ER.
Right.
And little did we know that wasn't going to happen. We were in there a long time.
And as they put us in this room, Cason's literally getting worse and worse and not talking to us. He's just kind of laying there.
He was kind of sleeping.
And, a nurse would come in and she would be like, is he always like this? And we're like, no. And she was like, okay, well, we need to, we're waiting. It's a Saturday and our psych doctor is not here. We have to, page him. And we're like, but this isn't psych. There's something wrong with him. And she was like, I know, but we need psych to come in and do an eval. And they didn't check his vitals. They didn't do anything. And you and I are sitting there like, what is happening? And hours passed. Nothing's happening. So I call his doctor and I said,
How long do you think we'd been there before we called her?
probably 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah, at least. I was going to say maybe close to 6, because I feel like we got there. Wasn't it like?
It was early morning.
Yeah, it was early morning. I feel like we had been in there. It was, I mean, it was probably late afternoon by the time it was probably mid-afternoon when we called her.
Yeah.
But we'd probably already been there, 5 or 6 hours. It's probably 3 o'clock or so.
Mm-hmm.
And we mentioned to her that, gosh, it just seems like nothing's happening. Maybe we should just go home, because he could just rest in bed at home.
Right.
And again, she said, no, don't do that. They absolutely need to do something about. Have they told you? Have they confirmed he has lithium toxicity? And we were like, no one has told us anything.
We haven't seen a doctor.
No one's been in here. So she said to stay, so we stayed. And I felt like we'd go 90 minutes and no one would come in the room,
But we could hear outside the door, because we were right near the nurse's station. You could hear them talk about Cason, and one of the nurses would be like, yeah, the psych patient's in there. We're just waiting for psych to come in. And
psych consult
and stuff. And we were getting furious because Cason's getting worse.
Yeah, we could tell Cason was, he had now reached a point where he seemed like he was delirious. Like, trying to talk to him, it's like he was looking through you, like he didn't recognize us. Mm-hmm. He seemed very disoriented. He seemed to be kind of going in and out of consciousness. It was getting pretty scary.
Right. We were really getting pissed off at this point, and you went out there.
I finally went out, and now this is probably
like 6 or 7.
Yeah, it's like dinner time. Mm-hmm. We're probably getting hungry, thinking about eating something. And I finally just went out to the nurse's station and I said, look, either someone's going to come in and give him an IV, or I'm going to do it myself.
Right.
Because there's clearly something going on here and no one's doing anything. And
that's when she's like, oh, well, we couldn't get this, the psychiatrist is tied up. And so we've just been waiting for a social worker to come in. And we're like, why
I said,
do we need a social worker?
We think he has lithium toxicity.
Right.
That does not require a social worker or a psych consult. That's down the road.
Right.
We need to take care of what's going on right now. And from the best I understand, he needs an IV. And
well, he needs blood work.
We need something.
But they were like, well, we need the social worker to come in first. And so we were really frustrated. So the social worker finally comes in, and she's an older woman, and she's just asking us the most, at this point, we think ridiculous questions, because what meds is he on? And, is he always like this calm?
Information they already have.
And we're like, and we're like yelling at her. And we're like, no, he's not this calm. He's bipolar. He's got Tourette's. He has autism. Do you not understand? This is not normal that he's just laying like this. And she's like, well, has there been a med adjustment? And we're like, no. And she finally was like, so are you here to get him admitted into psych? And we lost it.
Yeah.
Lost it. And I think that's when you literally said, we get us a doctor in here now. And she was kind of like, oh, okay.
And I said, look, we've been here for like 10 hours. Mm-hmm. And we haven't seen anyone. You're the first person we've really talked to besides an occasional nurse. Mm-hmm. I don't know much about lithium toxicity, but I know he's getting worse. I don't know how dangerous it is, but if it's getting worse, this is serious, and we need to do something about it. So they finally did bring in a doctor.
Yes. They called someone that's normally not in the ER from General Peds. She was upstairs, and she was a resident, and she was young. I do remember that. And when she came down, and she came in the room, and she took one look at him, and she was like, is he always like this?
The same question we've been asked, and the same question we'd answered. And again, we said, no. He's not normally like this.
And she was like, has anyone done blood work? And we're like, no. And so she instantly goes out, has 2 nurses come in, take his blood, and as we've talked
whoever that doctor was, she finally made things happen.
Yes, but as we've said in the past, blood tests for him, it's a nightmare. But this just shows you how Cason was literally unresponsive. They took so much blood, and he didn't flinch. He didn't do anything. He just laid there. And that was kind of our sign that there's something, this is not right.
She also asked if it's always that stiff.
Right, because at this point, his feet, like his legs were out really, really stiff, and his feet were kind of up like this. Yeah. And she was trying to move him down, and we're like, no, this is not normal. What you were seeing is not normal. So they came in and did labs, and she was like, we're putting a rush on the blood work. And I'm not kidding you, within 30 minutes, maybe, not even that long, the room, people are running in there. They're like, there was probably 2-3 doctors, a bunch of nurses, and of course he's still labeled the psych patient, which really made us angry. And they were like, he needs an IV immediately, but because he's a psych patient, we need to put restraints on him. And we were like, absolutely.
I was like, why does he need to be restrained? He's not even moving.
He's not responding to you. And they're like, yeah, but that's just what protocol for when the psych
and patient. I think I remember saying at the time, is protocol to wait nearly 12 hours before you do anything?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So they didn't restrain him.
They didn't end up restraining him. They put an IV in, and the doctor says his lithium came back at 2.5, and he's moderately toxic. And anything over 1.2, because remember the lithium range is very, very small.
Yeah. Therapeutic is 0.6 to 1.2.
So anything over 1.2 is toxic. And he was at 2.5, and he's 8, which is very dangerous.
Yeah.
And we're looking at her and the nurses and been like, seriously? Because
we've been here 12 hours.
Coma, death.
Well, no, we didn't know that stuff at the time.
No, not at the time. But
yes.
Later we find out that if we had gone home because we were not getting treatment and we didn't know what was wrong with them and we were just going to let him go home and sleep, his body wasn't getting rid of the lithium and he was getting more and more toxic. Well, come to find out, I mean, he could have been in a coma. He could have had massive seizure. He could have died. Long list of stuff, permanent neurological issues. And they weren't really apologetic about it.
Well, and we know why. Because they don't, they don't want to say anything or admit to anything that may lead to legal action, which I understand. It's still very frustrating, but I understand why they weren't. They were apologetic about how long we'd waited.
Right, but not the lack of care.
For.
And this just kind of starts the mental health has a horrible stigma to it. And
even in medical circles.
And this, in a children's hospital, the lack of knowledge, maybe is the right word, for mental illness and their, quote, protocol, and the fact that, yes, he has been technically a psych patient, but we reiterated multiple times, this is not psych. He's not manic. He's not violent. He's not wanting to hurt anybody or himself. He's sick. And they literally just kept saying, he's a psych patient. He's a psych patient.
And I think that goes hand in hand with the industry in general feeling like you can't diagnose a child with a severe mental disorder until they get to be a certain age, which is certainly older than 8, or it was at the time.
Yes, because in fact, the social worker, when she came in, she was questioning us on his bipolar diagnosis, and
so that's not possible.
Yeah, who's diagnosed him, and he doesn't look bipolar. Like, he's look at him, and you're just like,
yeah, and the frustration of, again, what's frustrating, and I think this goes to show how important it is for anyone who's listening to this, how important it is you have to advocate for your child or adult child. They obviously can't do it for themselves. Cason Cason was incapable of communicating in any way.
Right.
But you would think, going to a hospital where you have said we think he might have lithium toxicity, that they would be able to see the difference and say, well, he doesn't look bipolar. Well, he doesn't look bipolar because he has lithium toxicity. This is not the way he normally acts. You shouldn't have to say those things.
Right. And when we told them that we have been speaking with his treating psychiatrist, and we told her the symptoms, and she's the one saying, I'm afraid he might have this. Why would they ignore us and just watch a child get worse and worse and worse?
Yeah, it was disappointing and frustrating and
sad for Cason.
Scary and sad. So that was, and again, when we went in, we were not expecting to be hospitalized.
Right.
We just expected that. Well, I'm not sure what we expected, but I don't think we expected to be there overnight. We certainly didn't expect to be there 12 hours for anyone treated us.
No.
And I don't think that we necessarily thought that we would end up being admitted. But once they did the IVs and started to bring that stuff back under control, which there was a lot of blood tests because they had to keep checking his levels on lithium, that did eventually lead to an admission. But the problems didn't stop with, is he a psych patient? Is he a...
Right. Well, they admitted us that night because his levels were so high, and it takes a while to get the levels down. And so the treatment is a saline kind of solution.
Just to flush it out.
Flush it out and then stop the lithium. And you and I both are like, oh gosh, this is...
we don't want to do that.
We don't want to do that, but you can't obviously give him lithium when he's toxic.
Right.
So they admitted him. We ended up being there 7 days because it takes a while for that lithium to get out of his system. And then they had to make sure he didn't have permanent neurological
But they were fighting about who was treating him.
Right.
How he was going to be treated.
The whole 7 days we were there.
The whole time he was there, is psych in charge? Is general peds in charge? Every question, every decision, every conversation just couldn't end in a, yeah, we're doing this. It was, well, we have to check with the other side, and someone would say they weren't comfortable with something. They wouldn't do that. The other side would say they would if they would agree. I mean, it was a mess.
It was, because the first couple days, Cason still was out of it. Like, we were like, is he ever going to wake up? And so it took a while for him to, become alert and talkative and stuff like that. But it was, and the whole time they're doing constant finger pricks.
Yep.
They're checking his blood. And it was probably the third or fourth day. I was like, uh-oh, here's Cason, because a nurse came in, did a finger prick, and he punched her.
Yeah.
And I was like, uh-oh, this isn't good. And then that's when general peds would be like, well, he's becoming aggressive and violent, so maybe he needs to be inpatient with psych. Well, then the psych doctors would be like, yeah, he does need to be inpatient, but we're not going to do blood tests. We don't do medical, meaning, he cannot have his IV. And general peds and were like, well, he needs the IV because his lithium's still too high. And they would fight. Literally, they would fight back and forth. And you and I would have to get involved and be like, look, he has to have an IV. He still needs blood tests, so he has to stay here. As for psych, you guys are going to have to be put on the back burner. And general peds, you guys are going to have to understand, yes, he's a psych patient, but let's take some precautions. And if you're going to do a blood test or finger prick, tell us, and we'll have to help navigate, hold him down.
We'll help get this done.
Yeah, but you're going to have to treat him a little bit differently. He's not a, quote, neurotypical 8-year-old, and he's going to start getting mad and frustrated. And everybody was just kind of walking on eggshells.
Well, and I think what was frustrating was that in a lot of ways, it felt like no one wanted to take accountability for his care.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone was trying to avoid blame for what they thought might happen or whatever. So it was every day was a navigation of it was different. We were one of the things that we were going through, and we had only been 6 months. Had it even been that long? Yeah, I guess about 6 months since the day program, since that 1 month we'd done at the day program. And so we had kind of just gotten his cocktail back to where it was. Again, it wasn't working as great as it later would, but we had gotten it back to just kind of where we were. And now it was pretty evident. First of all, they're taking lithium out. It's pretty evident now we're starting all over, because they're flushing his entire system. You're involving 2 sets of doctors treating 2 different things.
Well, 3, because our treating psychiatrist was trying to help and interview,
but she's not primary.
Right.
Yet she's who we looked at as our primary care provider, but because he's in the hospital, she doesn't have that authority. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're interested in talking to her. It's basically these 2 sets of physicians that we're working with. And so we get the same questions. It felt like 20 times a day. Have you tried this medication? Why is he on this medication? Talking to us like we don't know what we're doing. What is your doctor doing? Why are they doing this? Mm-hmm. It was just every round there'd be a different set of doctors, and they would ask the exact same questions. And I remembered thinking, why are you asking us these questions if none of this is none of this getting written down or put into a system or whatever so that you can refer to documents and say, oh, I see this, I see that. But it didn't appear that was happening. Mm-mm. And over the course of that week, we ended up basically weaning him off almost everything because they wanted a clean slate to start fresh from. Which, again, in theory, I understand that, but we had discussed with them, look, we went through this 6 months ago. We can tell you that there are certain drugs he should not take. There are certain drugs that when he doesn't take, there are issues. We have some of this information. And they just kind of dismissed it. Mm-hmm. They were... I
think it wasn't until they finally did talk to Dr. T, and...
I would say a couple times.
The main one she was adamant they kept him on was the Zyprexa, because he was on a pretty decent dose, which was one of the antipsychotics. And it takes a while to ramp up on that one. And she was like, if you're going to lower anything, lower it just a little bit. You can, get rid of the sleep medicine. And I don't remember what the other one he was on. She's like, okay, wean him off of that. And obviously the lithium, but keep him on this one. And they fought her on it. Yeah. But they finally agreed. I think they ended up lowering it a little bit, but.
Well, they wanted to change the drug. They wanted to go with a different drug. I believe we went through a little bit of, he can't have bipolar, so he really shouldn't be taking these drugs. Ultimately, the main thing that we were concerned about was lithium toxicity, and that did get taken care of, and we haven't had that issue since then.
Thankfully. But the end of that week, that Friday, obviously Cason's lithium was almost at 0. Like, they wouldn't discharge him until his lithium was at 0, which is not good for him. But he was really, just getting angry a lot. And like, they brought his food and he didn't like it. And he threw the tray across the room. Yeah. And the head psych doctor lady came in and sat us down and was saying, okay, we highly, highly recommend that when they discharge him, that you move him inpatient, not the day program, but inpatient, because obviously, how can you take him home? He's, you can see the aggression. You can see that he's probably going to be violent again. And we highly recommend. And we would put our foot down and we're like, no, we're not doing that. We're going to bring him home. It's going to be hard.
And let's talk about why we felt so strongly about that. Let's talk about why, because look, a lot of people get put in this situation. What do you feel was the number one reason why we were so adamant about that?
I think mainly because of our experience over the summer.
Yep.
And how the meds got very jacked up. And you and I talked about it, and we were like, I think we're going to have more success working very closely to our doctor, which we had been. But I think we felt we knew what we were getting into with him being off lithium. We knew what to expect. We knew it was going to be hard. We knew he was going to have behaviors. But we felt he would do better and get better faster staying at home and us working with his doctor. And on top of that, it was just going to make our life even harder having him in the psych hospital, because we'd already been in a hospital. One of us was with him 24/7 for a week. Jackson was with my parents that whole week, and we felt bad for him because we didn't expect, like when we took Jackson on that Saturday morning to my parents, we didn't pack all his, we were like, okay, we'll see you later. We didn't really understand, and he didn't understand, wait, where are mom and dad and Cason? They're gone, because we didn't see him for a week. And we were just like, it's going to make our lives a lot harder. We're capable. We can do this. We know how to keep Jackson safe. We know what to look for. And we have a very competent doctor who we trust. And she understood Cason, and she was going to fight for him and help us in any way possible. So we made the decision to keep him home. And the hospital psych was not real happy with us on that decision.
Well, they told us that they didn't think it was the right decision.
Mm-hmm.
I know that primarily, man, just because of how hard it was to get him back on track after we got him back from that day program, that was the heaviest thing.
Right.
But I think that combined with the idea of paying thousands and thousands of dollars and feeling like we were just going to do all the work anyway, it just didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, they told us they thought we were making a mistake, and we agreed to disagree.
Right. And
we took him home, and we went through the same process that we did after the day program. We had to start him back over on his cocktail again, and
his doctor had to make a decision, and we had to make a decision. Do we put him back on lithium, knowing that we had just gone through this and that he had lithium toxicity? And it didn't take her very long to decide he needs lithium.
That was another interesting conversation, though. That was kind of the first time, he's been taking drugs his whole life that there are warnings about what the drugs will do to you. And in general, anyone who is dealing with that kind of has to weigh the benefits versus the risks. What I do remember was, it was kind of the first time, I guess, that I really heard. I'm sure she had said it before, but I think me, like most people, when you hear that a drug has potential side effects, but it's going to probably help you out, you worry about the side effects later. And so I probably was aware of things, but I wasn't as tuned into it. After having been toxic, and after having done the research about comas and potential death and all those things, she did have to remind us again that, look, these are dangerous drugs, and they, if taken over a prolonged period of time, they can damage organs and shorten lifespans. And I remember thinking, wow, this is a heavy decision, because
he's 8.
He's probably going to have to take medications like this or he's probably going to have to take this medication or medications like it for a very long time, if not the rest of his life. At the time, I'm thinking for a very long time.
Right.
Am I putting... It was the first time I really questioned, am I making a decision today that 30 years from now I'll say, oh my gosh, I played a hand in shortening his life? But ultimately, when we talked about that, we both agreed that it really has to be about the quality of life.
Right.
And no one had a quality of life when he wasn't properly, when he wasn't medicated.
Right.
He wasn't properly medicated for still a long time after this, but no one was having quality of life, especially him.
Right.
He was terrified of things, and he was,
Yeah, so she and us agreed to put him back on the lithium, and started very low dose, monitored him very, very closely, which we were thankful for. Got him into the therapeutic range. This time, remember how we had said he did better closer to that 1.0 1.0 level, but she didn't want to get that high just in case it just went over, because it's not that much, 1.2 and after that, you're toxic. So we kind of tried to get it around 0.8, and he needed more than that. But in return, she ended up putting him on a couple other meds to kind of help counteract the aggression.
The new cocktail.
Yeah, a new cocktail.
Right.
She went up more on the Zyprexa antipsychotic, which really did help him quite a bit. But that kind of started our journey with lithium, in the sense that we had to be hypervigilant. She had to be very hypervigilant, which she was and always has been. But like in the summertime, heat can affect his lithium, can raise it naturally. So we have to be very careful in the summer.
And he was already very fair-skinned. That didn't help.
Like when we'd go to Florida with our family on the trip, like we talked about, I mean, he could only be outside for short periods of time, because he'll tell you he would start feeling bad, and we would end up having to skip lithium doses on that trip because he felt bad, and horrible headaches, and just
and we would pay for that later.
Yeah. On that trip.
Yeah.
Vigilant about him drinking Gatorade, and
that was the main thing. I remember that we always knew he needed to be drinking a lot and flushing, but it's like anything else. Sometimes you have to experience something like going through the hospitalization thing that we did to realize, yeah, we've been making sure he's drinking, but now we're going to get pretty serious about it. We started sending him to school with a bottle of water and a bottle of Gatorade, and told him that, and told his teachers and everybody, hey, he needs to, when he comes home, these things need to be empty, and
refill this water thing.
And if he's not going to the bathroom with regularity, please remind him to go, or let us know, or whatever. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons. I think that has to be one of the reasons why we haven't experienced this again, because of how vigilant we were about keeping him hydrated and reminding him to urinate and make sure he was flushing it through. I mean, it was a trial and error to get it back to where it needed to be again, and stuck with it so that we make sure that it didn't happen again. But I think as a result of that, and there are lots of stories out there of people who are in our situation who spend a lot of time in inpatient. And I'm certainly not indicating that they
shouldn't.
It's not that we're better at something than they were, or anything like that. I think it is. It just goes back to what I said before. It's so important that you have to be the advocate for your child. You can't just allow, and it's crazy to say this, you just can't allow the medical opinions of I mean, when it comes down to it, it's generally you're listening to the medical opinion of one doctor, maybe a couple other doctors they've talked to. If you've gone to the emergency room, it's not like you're getting the benefit of, hundreds of doctors looking at this. You really have to weigh what you're hearing versus what you know.
And what you see, you live it every day as the parent. And,
you know your child better than anybody.
Right.
And if you know how they are when they're not on a certain medicine or when they're not in a certain environment, or they don't like to be touched or things like that, they don't know those things.
Right.
And if you just assume that, well, they're used to working with people who deal with things that my child has, so they'll figure it out. That's just not the way you should.
And I think that's what made it hard when he was in the hospital for that week, because nurses, they're on shifts every 12 hours. We get a new nurse, and even though his diagnoses are all in his charts, I'm not saying they would all look at it or would they understand it. And as you had just mentioned about not liking to be touched, Cason despises being touched. And in general peds population, when a nurse would come in to a neurotypical 8-year-old's room and they would lift up their arm to check the IV or whatever, it's not a big deal. But to someone like Cason, who literally it makes him furious when you touch him, they would come in and lift up his arm, and that would set him off. And the nurses would kind of look at us like, why is he acting like that? Why is he doing that? And we're like, oh, well, he has this and this, and and
I think that takes you back to the whole stigma that mental health tends to carry in general, but absolutely still in a hospital situation. The reality is that the majority of people that are going to hospitals are going there for a physical ailment. People are used to being, when they're in a hospital situation, they're used to being manhandled and having your, checking your blood pressure and all those things all the time.
But when you add in a mental illness / defect.
And that's common for people with autism to not want to be touched. But I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I completely and totally understand why Cason doesn't like to be touched. It could very easily be more than just that he's on the spectrum.
Right.
It could be because he has seen things and he has felt like he felt things, and he may literally feel threatened by it.
Right.
And because of that, the idea of putting him in an inpatient situation, I mean, I find it as troubling thinking about if I had to do that today and he's almost 23 than if I had done it at 8. I just for our child, I can't imagine that he would thrive in that environment. That he would find his way in that environment.
Well, and I think part of it, and we'll get into this down the road, but Cason's, when he's 8, we did not understand that he is going to be intellectually disabled. At 8, we didn't understand that. We had already noticed his IQ had dropped at age 7, but it's not until way later do we understand that he's at 8. This is kind of where the max of where he's going to mentally be functioning.
He might already be past it, actually.
Right. Yeah. So we didn't know that at the time. So when you talk about putting a almost 23-year-old in a psych hospital, now it would be an adult psych hospital, he does not think nor act like a 23-year-old, and he can't advocate for himself the way that we could.
The other thing, I mean, this still happens today. When we go to a doctor that he doesn't regularly see, or we do go to a doctor that he regularly sees, and he's seeing the PA or a nurse before, and that someone may be different than has ever seen him before. And while we were in the hospital, same thing happening. The point is, they would walk in and they would ask Cason questions. how are you feeling? Which I don't blame them for asking that, but when he can't express how he feels and they kind of are pressing him on it, that's when we'd step in and say, "Hey, how about we we'll try to help explain this for you."
Mm-hmm.
And we still run into situations. It's a we'll definitely talk about this later about guardianship and stuff like that. I mean, once your child is 18, it is very difficult to get people to not to act according to guardianship agreements.
Right. Right.
Where he has to answer that question. No, he doesn't. I will answer that question. But it's amazing to think. I understand that now, and for the last 5 years. But when he was 8, that just goes to show how important it is that you have to advocate, because even though they knew he was a quote psych patient, they were still treating him like a normal patient.
Mm-hmm.
They were expecting him to be able to tell them things that he is not capable of telling them.
That a neurotypical 8-year-old could
Right.
do. Yeah. And they would get frustrated.
And they would get frustrated pretty quickly,
Mm-hmm.
And we would have to step in, and we just felt like the 1 week we were there, we both felt like we had to be constantly aware of what was going on all the time. The idea of him being in an inpatient situation where neither of us is there was difficult to imagine.
Right.
And I'm sure that is difficult in general.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that you can't derive tremendous success from inpatient hospitalization. It just wasn't right for us.
It wasn't right for us. And we knew the battle it was going to be. We had kind of prepared ourselves that the next several months were going to be hard, and they were.
Well, the next several years were hard.
Well,
but
years,
yeah.
I'm saying,
Yeah.
but right when the lithium, when we
Right.
got out and the
Yeah.
lithium was low. But I think having the doctor we had and the support from her, and that she was all in to help him, and she was willing to talk to colleagues and all that kind of stuff. Because Cason, we get out of the hospital, and we had, prior to going in the hospital, remember, we were weaning him off the amantadine, which we do think kind of caused the lithium toxicity.
Played a hand in creating the
into it.
toxicity. Yeah.
And we were weaning off of it, if you remember, because he was having hallucinations.
We talked about that in the
last episode. And
right.
we, including his doctor, were thinking, okay, the amantadine is causing this. When we get it out of his system, it's going to be better. Well, unfortunately, over the next year plus, Cason's hallucinating a lot. It wasn't the amantadine. It becomes an almost daily thing. And as he gets a little bit older, he's able to talk to us a little bit about things, where he would look at us and he'd look around and be like, "Did you hear that?" And we're like, "No, I didn't hear anything." And you would hear him respond to something.
Someone.
He'd talk and he'd be like, "No," or "What'd you say?" And I always, at first, I thought he was talking to me. It's like, "Cason, I didn't say anything." And then he just kind of look at me weird, and sometimes he'd look out the back windows. There's a man outside, and I'd go and look, and there's not a man. And the snake,
constantly having to reassure him that those things aren't there, that it's okay.
He'd see that snake on the floor all the time. He started telling us that these little green men were flying around his room. Old men, he'd see
the old man.
Yep. The Jackson in kindergarten was the 100th day of kindergarten, and they had to, all the kids were supposed to dress up like an old man or old girl or old woman, and
an old person.
And Jackson had a cane, and we had like sprayed his hair gray and glasses and stuff.
I think he might have even had like a bald cap.
Yeah, it was.
And he looked like The guy from Up.
Yeah, he did. And he was all like hunched over and he's walking with his cane, and Cason saw him and freaked
Yeah.
out. And we're like, why are you so, what's the deal? And I mean, he was terrified of Jackson and wanted nothing to do with him, and come to find out it's because that's when Cason had been seeing an older man.
Which, it played in the same lines of that, Cason dressed up for Halloween until he was about 5.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, he was no longer interested in dressing up as anything.
And he hated Halloween.
And
come to find out, that's because he couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't real. And when he would see people dressed up or costumes or anything, he literally couldn't tell the difference. He did not understand pretend or like TV shows he would watch, and he would constantly ask us, these are real, right? And they're talking to me, right? And just very strange behavior.
Well, and I, there's a lot of these things we're talking about now are going to end up being topics of episodes we're going to do in the future, where we're actually attempting to provide some guidance for people on how they can best position themselves to be advocates for their children. I think one of the, if not the most critical aspect of our success story absolutely has to be our doctor. Mm-hmm. The fact that we found the right doctor. A lot of people will go see a doctor and they just stick with that doctor, even though they're asking themselves questions about things. We talked about how our first doctor came so highly regarded and respected and recommended, and he was not the right doctor for us. Not that he wasn't the right doctor for other patients, but he wasn't the right doctor for us. And we will talk about the questions that you should ask of your doctor and developing a relationship. But ultimately, I think what this hospitalization taught us was that it once again told us how long this road was going to be. It seems like that's a recurring theme in our life, that just about when we think we've got this thing figured out's the wrong word, but just about when we think we know what to expect, even if we don't like what's coming, something new gets introduced. Right. And the influence that you see from other stories certainly plays a part in that. Mm-hmm. Because it's difficult. I mean, everyone thinks they've got the most complicated case on the planet, until you hear other stories. And hopefully that's what we're going to be hoping to communicate, that every story is unique. Every journey is hard. But
the Cason's it's starting to take effect that this is unusual.
Yeah.
And he was already on an antipsychotic high dose, and we'd already tried several other ones, and she's starting to question why is he hallucinating and what's going on. And we're seeing more and more of that behavior, and she reaches out to a doctor I think she trained under, or one of her mentors, and he really only took extremely difficult pediatric psych patients. And she reached out to him about Cason and just kind of been like, okay, this is what's happening. This is what he's presenting with. What do we do? And she mentions to us he was about 9. And she mentions to us the next step would be to put him on a medicine for schizophrenia that is used only for schizophrenia, and it's called Clozaril. And she's like, but here's the deal. Most doctors will not prescribe it.
And let's stop right there, because Clozaril is a whole nother bag. That's the next chapter. I think let's neatly tie a bow on the hospital experience here, because Clozaril is coming.
And another surgery event.
There's plenty more to talk about. Yeah. There's plenty more to talk about. But
Clozaril is the next.
Clozaril, if my discussion earlier about, hey, is my child taking medication that may affect his life, and I thought I understood it then I got introduced to Clozaril, or clozapine, as it's also called. and that's a whole nother thing.
Another.
So we'll pick up there next.
Yes.
Until then, I'm Jeff.
I'm Kim.
All right, we'll see you next time on Specialness.